Acute inflammation. As we have studied in earlier video that what were the types of inflammation, what were its etiologies and why inflammation occurs. So here we are going to study the one of the type of inflammation. As we know, inflammation is of two types. One is acute and the other is chronic inflammation. So here in this video we are going to study about the acute inflammation. Why do we call it acute inflammation? What are the types and processes and the inflammatory response of it will be discussed later in this video. What is acute inflammation? Acute inflammation is a early body reaction which occur in a short time in response to any injury or infection. The chief inflammatory cell present in acute inflammation is the neutrophils. So, what are actually the acute inflammatory response, or how acute inflammation is divided into different events and processes? Let's see further. Acute inflammation is further, or you may say acute inflammatory response is further divided into two changes or two responses. The first is the vascular changes and the second is the cellular changes. In vascular changes, two types of changes mainly can occur. The first is the hemodynamic changes and the second is the altered vascular permeability. While in cellular changes, there are exudation of leukocytes and phagocytosis. Now further, let's discuss the vascular changes in details further. The first vascular change that occur is the hemodynamic changes. In hemodynamic changes, transient vasoconstriction occurs. What is transient vasoconstriction? If there is an arteriole, there occurs a constriction in the area where the inflammation occurs, and this constriction, vasoconstriction of moves in short time from one place to the next and to the next, and this shows the transient nature of vasoconstriction. If this occur in mild form of injury, it will occur about 3 to 5 seconds, but if it will occur in severe form of injury, it will occur for about or may last for about 5 minutes. The next is persistent progressive vasodilation. Persistent progressive vasodilation. In this, we will see that after the transient vasoconstriction of the arteriole, there the blood vessel will start to dilate. Before it was constricting, then it is starting to dilate. Therefore, there will be an increase of blood flow that will cause redness and warmth that we have seen earlier in the cardinal sign. Redness, which means rubor, and warmth or heat means calor. So in this process there is a vasodilation, which is of persistent, means that stays for a time, and progressive means that increases in the graph with a smaller part of flow to a larger part. Now what the next is increased blood flow. So as the part or blood vessel or arteriole is dilated, the part has increased the blood flow. As we have discussed earlier, will occur the redness or rubor, warmth or the calor, and due to this blood flow increase, there is a local hydrostatic pressure, and due to this local hydrostatic pressure increase, there is an outward flow of the transudation of fluid from the blood vessel, which results into the extracellular space, and this fluid here is called, once it enters the extracellular space, it is called extracellular fluid, which increases the amount of extracellular fluid in the space. We will see an inflamed part in the area, and thus we can see the third sign, that is tumor or swelling here. Now the next part or the next process of the hemodynamic changes are slowing or stasis. Slowing or stasis of microcirculation, which eventually causes the concentration of red blood cell increase, and thus the blood viscosity increases, and thus the next and last process which occurs is leukocytic migration. As the blood vessel has been punctured and the outflow of the fluid or transudation occurs, there will be first the attachment to the border or peripheral orientation of leukocyte on the endothelium wall, and later it will move out to the part inflamed, and thus it will take on the process of phagocytosis. So here we conclude our hemodynamic changes in this acute inflammation. First it was transient vasoconstriction, then persistent progressive vasodilation, increased blood flow due to which the hydrostatic pressure also increased and outflow, then slowing or stasis, which increases the blood viscosity, and thus the leukocyte first at the margin and then later move to the part where the inflamed cells are present. Thus this defines our hemodynamic changes. Now moving on to the next change, that is altered vascular changes of the vascular events. There is two types of movement that occurs, that is one which causes the outward movement and the other which causes the inward movement. Forces that causes the outward movement are the intravascular hydrostatic pressure and colloid osmotic pressure of interstitial fluid, while the forces that causes the inward movement of interstitial fluid into the circulation are intravascular, colloid, intravascular, colloid, osmotic pressure, and hydrostatic pressure of interstitial fluid. These two alternates thus helps in the occurring a little fluid which is left, means basically there is an outward flow, there is an inward flow, so a very little interstitial fluid is left out, which does not occur a much inflamed part or shows a much inflamed to the inflammation or acute inflammatory. So we can see normally no edema is resulted, but in case of edema or the place inflamed shows edema. What are that cases where we can see edema? So if there is no edema, do we can call it an inflammation? There is arising in one question. This is a process which we have discussed which occur normally in our body, and thus there is an inflow, there is an outflow, and no inflammatory part is seen. But in case of inflammation, edema is seen because of the endothelial linings leakage, and due to this leakage there is an excessive outflow than inflow, and thus we can see an inflamed part, and thus this way the altered vascular changes can be seen in our body. Next is the cellular changes in our body. The first is exudation of leukocytes. Exudation of leukocyte, the first process that occurs is the change in the flow of blood. Basically, as we have seen in the first hemodynamic changes, there is an increased flow of blood in the inflamed part. So there is a change in the blood flow, and thus which causes stasis, which intently or causes blood viscosity. Due to the slowing of stasis, the central stream of cell widens and peripheral plasma zone narrows because loss of plasma by exudation. This phenomena is called margination. As a result of this redistribution, neutrophil of the central column comes to the vessel cells, and this is called pavementing. So next is the rolling and adhesion. The peripherally marginated and pavemented neutrophils slowly roll over the endothelial cells lining the vessel wall, and this forming a sticky transient leukocyte to endothelial cells. The process of rolling is facilitated by following cell adhesion molecules, or we can say in short CAMs, or adhesion receptors, that is ARS. So now moving to the next step, that is transmigration. After the leukocyte endothelium adhesion, neutrophil move along the endothelial surface till a suitable site between endothelial cell is found where neutrophil through the cytoplasmic pseudopods. So subsequently, the neutrophil lodge between the endothelial cell and the basement cell membrane cross the basement membrane by damaging it locally with secreted collagens and escape out into the extravascular space, and thus this is known as transmigration, which in short you can define it like a migration of the neutrophil in the extravascular space. As you have known, neutrophil is the dominant cell in acute inflammatory response. So, in this you can see the dominancy of the neutrophils, and as it is a dominant cell, in the first 24 hours leukocyte in the first 24 hour neutrophils will act, and in the next 24 to 48 hour monocytes and macrophages. As neutrophil survives less or is of short duration, and monocyte and macrophage are of longer duration. Now moving on to the chemotaxis. Chemotaxis is basically the movement of leukocyte towards the direction of chemical molecules or factors called chemoattractants. So what occurs is that after the transmigration of leukocyte, after crossing several barriers to reach the interstitial tissue, is a chemotactic factor mediated process. Thus, due to which the leukocyte moves to the chemical molecules, and thus the exudation of leukocyte is hence discussed below. Next, moving on to the phagocytosis. What is actually phagocytosis? Let's define it. Phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is defined as the process of cellular engulfment of solid materials. So, thus, what actually does? Neutrophil actually engulf solid materials in it and kills it to save the other cells in the body. It occurs or can be discussed in three processes. First, it is recognition and attachment. So, the neutrophil first will recognize the part or the cell and attach to it. Then, it will try to engulf it in it, and later on it will kill the cell and degrade it, and the other cell will not be damaged anymore, and this cell is killed and degraded, and thus the person who has an acute inflammation will be healed and will become a healthy person. And this way the process has been discussed. Thank you.